a student headed off to university for her classes, but she never made it back home. When police stepped in, they quickly uncovered chilling clues, but that was only the beginning. By the time they finally solved this case, it had shaken not just all of Australia, but far beyond its borders, and its echoes are still felt to this day. Sophie Colombet was born in 1993 in a small French village called Saint-Julien-Mont-Denis. It was a quiet, picturesque place in the Alps, where Sophie grew up with her parents and two older brothers. From an early age, she had a passion for music and even played in her village's local ensemble. She also dreamed of seeing the world. After finishing school, Sophie moved to Denmark to study international business, and later, she went to Germany for an internship. Then, in 2013, she was accepted into a master's program at Griffith University in Brisbane, Australia. She moved there with her boyfriend, and the two of them rented an apartment near the university. But a year later, his visa expired and he returned to France. Sophie still had one more year left to finish. And at first, she thought about going back with him. In the end, though, she decided to stay and complete her degree. On top of her studies, Sophie worked several jobs just to make ends meet, waiting tables, doing cleaning work, and even giving private French lessons. But it still wasn't enough to afford her own place, so she moved in with some university friends who were sharing an apartment. On the morning of March 27, 2014, 21-year-old Sophie set out for the university as usual. That day, her classes were scheduled to run late into the evening. Throughout the day, she kept in touch with her boyfriend, messaging back and forth. Then, sometime that evening, she suddenly stopped replying. By the next morning, there was still no word from her, and he began to panic. After trying and failing to reach her by phone, he went online to check the Brisbane Police Department's social media page, hoping for any sign of her. That's when he stumbled on a brand new post. Police had uploaded photos of several pieces of women's jewelry, asking the public for help identifying who they belonged to. The moment he saw those pictures, his heart sank. He knew those items immediately. They were Sophie's. He called the Brisbane police right away and told them what he'd seen. And that's when they finally told him what had happened. Early that morning, police were contacted by a homeless man who lived in a park not far from Sophie's apartment. He told them that while walking through the park, he'd noticed someone lying on a bench, covered with old newspapers as if trying to keep warm. At first, he thought it was just another person sleeping rough for the night, but when he got closer, he saw it was a young woman. He tried to wake her, shook her shoulder, called out to her, but there was no response. That's when he noticed blood matted in her hair. He reached out to check for a pulse and felt nothing. Realizing she was dead, he immediately went to the police. Officers confirmed that the young woman had died and sent her body to medical examiners. The autopsy revealed a devastating head injury, the fatal blow with a heavy object. They also found numerous abrasions and confirmed that she'd been sexually assaulted. Investigators concluded she'd been attacked just a few yards from that bench and then dragged over and left there. Whoever did it had placed her on the bench and covered her with newspapers, likely hoping her body would go unnoticed. And, in that park, it made sense. The area was a known hangout for the homeless, and seeing someone asleep on a bench was nothing unusual. If that's what the killer was counting on, it worked. According to medical experts, the attack happened the previous evening, but Sophie didn't die right away. She lived for several more hours. She remained on that bench until late into the night, slowly succumbing to her injuries. If someone had called for help, doctors might have been able to save her. But no one called. Most people, it seems, simply thought she was another homeless person asleep in the dark. Once police sent Sophie's boyfriend a photo of the victim and he confirmed it was her, detectives threw everything they had into the investigation. One of their first priorities was to find her clothes and belongings, because when her body was discovered, she was wearing nothing but her jewelry. But after combing through the park and checking every nearby trash bin, they didn't find a single trace. Investigators then began piecing together Sophie's final day, step by step, to try and retrace her movements. Footage from a CCTV camera near her apartment showed her leaving that morning and boarding a bus to the university. She spent almost the entire day on campus, and at about 8:30 that evening, she headed home. By then, it had started raining. A classmate offered to give her a lift, but Sophie turned him down, saying she'd just take the bus. Cameras near the bus stops captured her getting on and later getting off at her usual stop. From there, she would have needed to walk across a bridge over the river to get home. But to reach that bridge, she first had to cut through the very same park where her body was later found. After that point, there was no more footage, nothing to show what happened next. Detectives turned to the public, hoping someone might have seen something that rainy night. But almost no one had been out in that weather. And that gave the killer the perfect chance to attack her in the middle of that tiny park without being seen. Police also asked the public to keep an eye out for any of Sophie's missing belongings. She'd been carrying a phone, a tablet, an umbrella, and her handbag. When none of those items turned up in the park, they brought in divers to search the river. Before long, the divers found an umbrella about a mile downstream. But even then, investigators couldn't say for sure if it belonged to Sophie. News of Sophie's murder immediately drew massive attention across the city, and for more than one reason. First, police openly admitted they couldn't rule out the possibility that the killer might strike again. And second, Sophie was the fourth international student murdered in Brisbane in just a few months. Even though those other cases were unrelated and the suspects in them had already been caught, people were starting to see a chilling pattern, and the sense of unease kept growing. Meanwhile, detectives kept digging through surveillance footage near the park, combing through hours upon hours of video. Then, finally, they spotted someone. A man walking past the park both before and after the estimated time of Sophie's death. That time window had been narrowed down almost to the minute, based on Sophie's movements captured by other cameras. What really made him stand out wasn't just how often he appeared near the park. It was the fact that he never came forward, despite repeated public appeals asking anyone who'd been in the area that night to contact police. Even with the heavy rain, dozens of people reached out saying they'd passed through or nearby at some point. But this man's name never came up. Investigators tried to follow his trail. Cameras showed him entering a subway station near the park and riding a few stops. After that, though, the trail went cold. They suspected he might have been heading toward the train station near the airport, possibly to catch a train out of the city. Detectives went back to the park to speak with people who'd spent most of their time there, hoping someone might recognize the man from the footage. Before long, they found a witness who said he'd actually been drinking with that man on the night of the murder. According to him, the man's name was Ben, and he'd been staying at a homeless hostel a few miles from the park on the other side of the river. That hostel already had a bad reputation. Many of the residents were recently released prisoners with nowhere else to go. Police headed over there and showed staff a photo of the man from the surveillance footage. They recognized him immediately and confirmed that he was indeed one of their residents, 25-year-old Benjamin Millward. The staff also mentioned something unsettling. They hadn't seen Benjamin since the night Sophie was killed. He'd simply vanished, leaving behind almost all of his belongings, as if he'd left in a hurry. All of this gave police every reason to dig deeper, and finding Benjamin quickly became their top priority. 8 days after the murder, they went public with his name and photo, asking anyone with information on his whereabouts to come forward. As detectives looked into his background, they discovered that Benjamin had quite a record. Back in 2012, he'd been released from prison, where he was serving time for assault. But soon after, he was arrested again for violating parole and only gained full freedom in 2013. On top of that, his record included theft charges and a string of lesser offenses. Investigators also learned something else while speaking with other hostel residents. One of them said that just hours before Sophie's murder, Benjamin had been heavily drunk and under the influence of drugs. Benjamin even admitted to him that he hadn't used in a long time. And the last time he did, things went badly. Another resident reported seeing Benjamin in the park around 5 p.m., taking another dose. After that, they went their separate ways because the resident wanted to get back to the hostel before it locked up at 9 p.m. Benjamin, however, never returned that night. That same resident later recalled spotting him outside the building around 11 p.m. after Sophie's murder and said Benjamin looked deeply unsettled, nervous, and was acting strangely. While police waited for leads on his whereabouts, Benjamin's relatives and acquaintances began reaching out. Every single one of them insisted they didn't believe he could be involved in a murder. His family said they hadn't heard from him since the day Sophie was killed, and they even went on TV pleading with him to come forward and clear his name. But Benjamin stayed silent, and detectives grew more and more convinced that he'd already left the city. They circulated his photo and details to other towns and states, hoping someone would spot him. Before long, they got a promising lead. Staff at a small hotel in a town called Ballina, located in another state, reported that a man matching Benjamin's description had stayed with them for a few days, but he was already gone. Police immediately alerted officers in nearby towns, warning them that Benjamin might be moving through the area. And soon enough, 2 officers in a coastal city called Coffs Harbor, just a few dozen miles from that hotel, noticed a man on the street in the middle of the night who looked just like him. They approached and asked, "Are you Benjamin?" And the man calmly replied, "Yeah, you got me. Is this because of the internet?" He was immediately arrested and extradited back to Brisbane. Detectives took his DNA and it matched the skin particles found under Sophie's fingernails, finally and undeniably tying him to her murder. After Benjamin was placed in custody to await trial, his lawyer spoke to the media. He said his client was feeling overwhelmed by all the pressure surrounding the case, but otherwise, he was doing fine. Once in court, Benjamin didn't try to deny what he'd done. During the proceedings, he admitted to the murder in front of the judge and even asked Sophie's family for forgiveness. But then, he revealed a detail that left everyone in the courtroom stunned. According to him, after attacking and assaulting Sophie, he told her he was going to get help. Yet instead, he simply walked away, leaving her to die alone on that park bench in the pouring rain. Before fleeing the city, he also threw all of her belongings into the river. As for his motive, Benjamin claimed that he hadn't been in control of himself, blaming everything on the drugs he'd taken. He said he barely remembered the attack at all, recalling only fragments of what he'd done to her. However, experts cast serious doubt on Benjamin's claims. They explained that the substances he'd taken on the day of the murder typically don't drive someone to commit a crime this violent, and certainly not something so calculated. His condition, they said, couldn't be used as an excuse. On top of that, the drugs wouldn't normally cause such severe memory loss, yet Benjamin insisted he could barely remember anything. And, as investigators pointed out, he'd been clear-headed enough to buy train tickets and leave the city without drawing attention to himself. In the end, the court sentenced Benjamin to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after serving at least 20 years. He also received an additional 15 years for the sexual assault to be served at the same time. So, given his age, Benjamin could still walk free before he turns 50. It's also worth noting that Benjamin's mother spoke to reporters after the trial. She praised her son for admitting what he'd done and said she blamed the drugs for everything that happened, insisting that he would never have done something like this sober. In the end, the case was solved relatively quickly, but the shockwaves it sent through Brisbane lasted much longer. After Sophie's death, locals demanded that authorities step up security in that park and called out the hostel for accepting anyone at all, including recently released violent offenders and murderers. Many women came forward with their own stories of being harassed in that same park, saying they'd never once seen police in that area. Memorials were held all over the city. More than 2,000 people joined a candlelight march, following the route Sophie should have taken home that night. Her funeral took place in her hometown in France, and it drew nearly 1,200 people out of a village of just 1,500. It became the largest funeral the village had seen in decades, since the death of a beloved mayor. So many came to pay their respects that mourners ended up filling 8 entire journals with condolences. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section, and don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video. Thank you for watching. A young mother disappears without a trace, leaving behind more questions than answers. As police dive into the case, every new clue only makes things more puzzling. But eventually, a chilling trail of evidence leads them to a dark truth, one that no one saw coming. Ashley Mead was born on November 14, 1991, in the small town of Warren, Pennsylvania. She grew up in a big family, surrounded by siblings. From an early age, Ashley had a deep love for all things creative. She was passionate about singing, poetry, and fashion. She was also a huge nature lover and always dreamed of traveling. Over the years, she explored almost every state in the US and even visited Canada and Mexico. After finishing high school, Ashley moved to New York to study liberal arts. Later, she transferred to Louisiana State University in Shreveport. That's where she met a guy named Adam, and the two started dating. For the next few years, Ashley stayed focused on her studies until her life took a sudden, devastating turn. She was in a serious car accident, which led to a long and difficult recovery. And even though she eventually managed to get back to her normal life, she now had a new problem: medical bills. The debt piled up during her treatment, and she had no choice but to drop out of school and start working full-time. Around that same time, things between her and Adam started falling apart. Eventually, the two decided to break up, but almost immediately after that, Ashley found out that she was pregnant. Despite everything she had been through in the past few years, she was overjoyed and couldn't wait to become a mom. She also wanted her child to grow up in a two-parent home, so she and Adam agreed to co-parent their daughter. By then, Adam had moved to Boulder, Colorado, to study culinary arts and become a chef, and Ashley decided to follow him there. Ashley and Adam rented an apartment in a small residential complex, and before long, their daughter, Winter Daisy, was born. Even though they had decided not to get back together, they were both completely devoted to their little girl, sharing the responsibilities of raising her and giving her all their love. A few months after Winter was born, Ashley got a job as a teaching assistant at a preschool. Later, she joined an organization that helped children from low-income families get ready for school. The work was tough, but Ashley had a natural way with kids. They loved her from the start. This continued until February 2017. By then, Ashley was 25 years old, raising her one-year-old daughter and working with kids. But, on February 13th, she didn't show up for her shift. Her coworkers found it odd. They tried calling and texting her, but she never responded. The next day, when she missed work again, one of her colleagues decided to contact the police. She asked them to check on Ashley and her daughter to make sure that they were okay. The local police department sent officers to her apartment complex. As soon as they got there, they noticed a few strange things. The outdoor lights near the entrance were on, even though it was the middle of the day. The front door was unlocked, so the officers stepped inside, but there was no sign of Ashley, her daughter, or Adam. As they looked around, more red flags popped up. Ashley's belongings, her phone, driver's license, and purse were still inside, yet her car was missing from the parking lot, which didn't make sense. Then, in the kitchen, they found something even more unsettling: a half-cooked meal left in the oven. As if someone had started making dinner but, for some reason, never finished and never came back. All of this seemed suspicious, so the police decided to contact Ashley's parents. Her mother told them she hadn't heard from Ashley in days and had no idea where she might have gone. She also found it strange that Ashley had left her cat behind, something she never did. According to her mom, Ashley always took the cat with her wherever she traveled, no matter where she went. Desperate for answers, her mother started reaching out to family and friends, hoping someone had heard from Ashley, but no one had spoken to her in days. Meanwhile, the police tried calling Adam, but he wasn't answering either, and when investigators attempted to track his phone, they made another unsettling discovery. It had been turned off. As for Ashley's phone, the police handed it over to the experts, and they quickly uncovered several important clues. The data showed that the last time Ashley used her phone was on February 12th, 2 days before her coworker reported her missing. It was her day off and she had spent it running errands with her daughter. She visited a few stores, picked out a new dress, and snapped some photos before heading home. After speaking with Ashley's neighbors, detectives were able to piece together more details about that evening. One neighbor recalled seeing her taking out the trash around 6 p.m. Then, sometime before 9 p.m., another neighbor heard a loud, heavy thud coming from Ashley's apartment. She thought it sounded like someone falling down the stairs. But after that, everything went silent and she didn't hear anything else. This detail caught the investigators' attention, especially since Ashley's phone activity had stopped right around 9 p.m. That made them suspect something bad might have happened to her at that exact moment. Soon they got another lead. Data from her phone revealed that, shortly before her disappearance, Ashley had started dating a man named Harvey. Detectives went through their messages and found something interesting. His texts gave off a suspicious vibe, and that was enough for police to want to talk to him in person. When officers showed up at Harvey's house, he allowed them to search the place without a warrant. He insisted he had no idea where Ashley was and claimed he hadn't spoken to her in days. According to him, on the night she vanished, he was hanging out with friends and his alibi checked out. They all confirmed his story. Harvey even let the police go through his phone, and the data backed up his claims. So, for now, he didn't seem to be involved. With Harvey ruled out as a suspect, detectives kept searching for new leads. Since they still hadn't found any trace of Ashley, they decided to take a different approach, tracking down Adam's relatives in hopes of locating him. And that's when they finally caught a break. When investigators contacted Adam's parents in Louisiana, they revealed something interesting. Adam had stopped by their house just a day earlier, on February 13th. According to his parents, Adam had arrived with his daughter, but without Ashley. They were completely caught off guard by his visit, especially since he hadn't told anyone he was coming. That alone seemed odd, considering the drive from Colorado to Louisiana was almost 1,000 miles. But Adam had a simple explanation. He claimed he had been planning the trip for a while so that his daughter could spend time with her relatives. Despite the surprise, his family was happy to see them. Adam stayed the night, and the next day he left for Arkansas to visit his grandmother. Detectives asked his relatives to reach out and tell him to call the police right away because they needed to know where Ashley was. At first, Adam didn't pick up their calls, but eventually he turned on his phone and contacted the detectives. Adam told them he had no idea where Ashley was and claimed he had been trying to reach her the entire time, but she never answered his calls or texts. According to his story, on the evening of February 12th, they got into a serious argument, one that turned physical. He admitted that he had hit her. After that, he decided to leave the house for a while to avoid escalating the situation any further, and he took Winter with him. He also admitted to taking Ashley's car, saying he didn't have one of his own. At that point in the conversation, Adam revealed that he had already left Louisiana and was driving through Oklahoma. Adam's story didn't sit right with the detectives. The more they thought about it, the more they suspected he might have played a direct role in Ashley's disappearance. But, since he was in another state, they couldn't just bring him in for questioning. Then, they noticed a critical detail. Adam wasn't listed on Winter's birth certificate. Legally, that meant he had no right to take her out of state without Ashley's permission, so detectives used this to their advantage. They contacted police in Oklahoma and asked them to detain him. A few hours later, patrol officers spotted Ashley's car on the road. Adam was taken into custody, and thankfully, Winter was found safe with him. While detectives prepared for his interrogation, forensic experts searched the car, and what they found was deeply unsettling. Under one of the back seats, they discovered traces of blood. When they ran a DNA test, the results confirmed it belonged to Ashley. For the first time, investigators had physical evidence suggesting that Ashley might no longer be alive, but they still had no idea what had actually happened to her. That was about to change, though, because another clue was just around the corner. Soon after speaking with Adam's parents, detectives received an unexpected call from his younger sister. She told them that she hadn't been able to see Adam and Winter the day they arrived. Instead, she stopped by their parents' house the following morning. By that time, their parents had already left for work and Adam was supposed to be getting ready for his trip to another state. But, the moment she walked in, his reaction caught her off guard. He looked genuinely shocked to see her. He seemed extremely nervous, and something about his behavior felt off. Then, she noticed something strange. Cleaning supplies were scattered everywhere, and it looked like Adam had been scrubbing something in the guest bedroom. When she asked him what was going on, he gave her a bizarre explanation. He claimed he had suddenly felt sick and thrown up on the floor, so he was just trying to clean it up before leaving. She offered to help, but Adam immediately refused. Instead, he rushed her out of the house. Detectives wasted no time. They headed straight to Louisiana and began searching the house with a team of forensic experts. And what they found was horrifying. In the guest bedroom, where Adam had been cleaning when his sister walked in, investigators discovered multiple traces of blood. But that wasn't all. In the backyard shed, they found an electric saw and a barbecue lid, both covered in blood. When the evidence was sent to the lab, the results confirmed what detectives had already suspected: the blood belonged to Ashley. At this point, it was clear she hadn't simply disappeared. Something terrible had happened to her, but there were still so many unanswered questions. If Adam had killed her in Colorado, why would he transport her body more than 1,000 miles away? And what did he do with it after leaving his parents' house? As detectives prepared to confront Adam with all these questions, the case took another unexpected turn. That same day, February 15th, police in a small town in Oklahoma reached out with disturbing news. Earlier that morning, a gas station employee went outside to take out the trash when she noticed a suitcase sitting near the dumpster. It looked brand new, which struck her as odd. Why would someone throw it away? Curiosity got the best of her, and she decided to take a look inside. But the moment she unzipped it, she immediately regretted it. Inside were human remains. When police officers arrived, they confirmed that the suitcase contained a human torso. The remains were sent to a lab for DNA testing, but at first, investigators had no way of identifying the victim. Then, word began to spread about Ashley's disappearance. Oklahoma detectives connected the dots and reached out to their colleagues working on her case. They shared the DNA sample from the torso, and it was a match. Investigators requested surveillance footage from the gas station, specifically the cameras covering the dumpster area. What they found was exactly what they expected: footage of Ashley's car pulling up. Adam stepped out, carrying the very same suitcase, and left it next to the dumpsters before driving away. With this, detectives were finally able to piece together a chilling timeline of what likely happened to Ashley. Based on all the evidence, they believed Adam had killed her on the night of February 12th while they were at home. After that, he came up with a plan. Visiting his relatives would give him the perfect cover to get rid of her remains in multiple states, making it harder for police to track them down. Since Ashley's blood had been found inside his parents' house, detectives suspected Adam had transported her body there. He waited until his parents left for work, then used their electric saw to dismember her remains. After that, he hit the road, dumping pieces of her body along the way. This realization made one thing painfully clear: Adam could have stopped anywhere along his route, which stretched for hundreds of miles. That made the search for the rest of Ashley's remains incredibly difficult, but detectives weren't ready to give up. They carefully reconstructed Adam's travel path, tracing his journey from his parents' house to the spot where he was arrested. Their goal was to find more surveillance footage that might show him disposing of additional remains. Eventually, they found what they were looking for: CCTV footage from a gas station in the small town of Morrilton, Arkansas. The video showed Adam throwing something into a dumpster, but there was a major problem. By the time investigators discovered this, the dumpster's contents had already been taken to a landfill. Determined to recover whatever he had discarded, police launched a massive search effort. More than 40 people were sent to comb through the landfill, but despite their best efforts, they found nothing. Even though Adam's guilt seemed almost undeniable, the fact that parts of Ashley's body were still missing posed a serious challenge. Without a full body, medical examiners couldn't determine her exact cause of death. The torso showed some cuts and abrasions, but these injuries had been sustained while she was still alive, likely as she fought back against her attacker that night. As for Adam, he stuck to his story. Even when detectives laid out all the evidence in front of him, he refused to confess. He insisted that he and Ashley had argued and he had simply left with their daughter, that she had been alive when he last saw her. But, with the overwhelming amount of physical evidence against him, detectives didn't need a confession. They arrested Adam and charged him with murder. As prosecutors built their case, they uncovered another damning piece of evidence: Adam's personal journal. Inside, he had written about wanting to kill Ashley long before it actually happened. His journal revealed deep resentment. He believed she was only staying with him for the sake of their daughter. And, in a way, he wasn't wrong. Ashley really was living with him just for Winter, but that had been their mutual agreement from the start. Still, Adam had wanted more from their relationship, while Ashley didn't feel the same way. At the same time, he wrote extensively about how much he loved his daughter and how terrified he was that Ashley might take her away from him. According to the prosecution, this was the breaking point for Adam. They believed he was jealous that Ashley had started seeing someone new, even though their own relationship had ended nearly 2 years earlier. More than anything, he feared she might leave him for good, taking their daughter with her. That, they argued, was what pushed him to commit murder. And, in a desperate attempt to cover his tracks, Adam tried to make it look like Ashley had simply vanished. He even called and texted her after killing her, pretending to be worried, as if he had no idea where she had gone. Before the trial began, it was revealed that Adam had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder and PTSD from his time in the military. But that didn't change a thing. He was still found guilty and held accountable for his actions. In April 2018, a jury unanimously found him guilty of murder. He was sentenced to life in prison, plus an additional 12 years. Adam later tried to appeal the verdict, but his request was denied. To this day, he remains behind bars and still refuses to reveal where he disposed of the rest of Ashley's remains. One final detail I want to mention. After Adam's arrest, Winter was placed in the custody of Child Protective Services, despite both sides of the family wanting to take her in. What happened to her after that remains unknown, as authorities have kept this information private due to her age. So, all that's left is to hope she was eventually placed with relatives and not left in the foster care system. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section and don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video. Hi guys, my name is Brandon, and today we'll delve into the case of a young mother who went out to celebrate New Year's and disappeared. Police uncovered some eerie clues, but couldn't get to the truth. It wasn't until 35 years later that there was a long-awaited breakthrough, and everyone finally learned what happened to her on that fateful New Year's Day. Tanya McKinley was born on January 25, 1961, in the small American town of Milton, Florida. Growing up in a loving family, she shared a close bond with her older sister. They enjoyed playing outside together, skateboarding and bowling. After finishing high school, Tanya decided to move to Pensacola, about 25 miles away from her hometown. She wanted to explore the medical field and focused on one of the quickest professions to enter, a medical transcriptionist. No medical degree was required to become one. All Tanya needed was to attend special courses. Her cousin, Vanita, chose to relocate with her, and the two women shared an apartment to save on rent. Soon after moving, Tanya met a guy named Tim, and they began dating. Eventually, they moved in together, and in 1983, their son, Timothy, was born. While Tanya was thrilled to become a mother, her relationship with Tim wasn't perfect. They argued quite often, and about a year after their child's birth, they decided to part ways. At the end of '84, Tanya temporarily moved in with her cousin, who by that time had a husband and 2 children. Tanya planned to find a place of her own and move out as soon as she gets the opportunity. On December 31st, Tanya, along with Vanita and her husband, decided to celebrate New Year's Eve at a local bar. They left their kids at a late-night daycare and set off to ring in the new year. They had a lively evening, filled with laughter and dancing. Tanya also saw a lot of familiar faces at the bar. When midnight struck, they welcomed the new year of 1985, and Vanita, with her husband, prepared to head home. The daycare, where they had left their children, was closing at 1 a.m., giving them just 1 hour to pick them up. But Tanya wanted to stay at the bar a little longer. Given that her sole focus had been on work and caring for her son for the past 2 years, this was her only opportunity to unwind and relax, so she didn't want to miss it. Tanya asked her sister to pick up her son from the daycare, and Vanita agreed. Since they lived together and Vanita had to collect her own kids, it wasn't a problem. Before parting ways, Vanita asked Tanya how she planned to get home since they had arrived at the bar in their car. But Tanya assured her that she would easily find someone to give her a ride, considering the fact that there were many familiar faces at the bar. On the morning of January 1st, Vanita woke up and, to her surprise, realized that Tanya had not returned yet. It seemed odd, since she should have been back long ago. Vanita thought that Tanya might have gone to stay with one of her friends, so she wasn't overly concerned initially. But everything changed soon after. Vanita's worried mother-in-law knocked on their door, delivering the shocking news. Tanya had been found dead. That night, around 3 a.m., a Pensacola resident and her daughter headed to a vet clinic due to some urgent health issues with their dog. However, as the woman left home, her daughter noticed something strange on the roadside. She thought it was a mannequin and mentioned it to her mother. The woman decided to take a closer look and was horrified to realize it was a human body. She immediately returned home and called the police. Officers arrived at the scene and found the body of a young woman lying in an empty lot near the road. Her tights were pulled down, the dress was lifted, and her shoes were missing. Next to the victim, they discovered a blue towel with red stains resembling blood. Police identified the deceased as 23-year-old Tanya McKinley. A few streets away, they discovered her shoes, along with a purse containing an ID in her name. The body was handed over to medical experts, while investigators continued to examine the crime scene. It was quickly established that the victim was likely killed elsewhere. There was no blood near her body except for the towel stains, and there were traces on the ground indicating that the body had been dragged from the road towards the roadside. On the towel and the victim's body, police found their first potential leads. There were several human hairs, as well as pubic hairs and dog fur. They assumed that the first two samples belonged to the killer, possibly someone with a dog. Medical experts determined that Tanya suffered a blow to the head with a heavy object, but the cause of death was strangulation. They also confirmed that the victim had been sexually assaulted. The experts collected a semen sample from her body, but in those years, DNA analysis had not yet become widely used in forensics. All they could establish was that the suspect had type B blood. Considering that these clues didn't lead detectives to the killer, they began compiling a list of potential suspects. Their focus initially shifted to Tim, the victim's ex-boyfriend. Speaking with Tanya's relatives and friends, the police learned about the issues in their relationship and constant arguments both before and after the birth of their son. It turned out that when Tanya decided to end the relationship, Tim was against it. He didn't want to part ways with Tanya and continued trying to persuade her. Tim consistently called Tanya, visited her, and behaved as if he couldn't accept the breakup. Investigators considered that on New Year's Eve, Tim might have followed Tanya to the bar, leading to a confrontation that ended in murder. They brought the man in for questioning, but he denied any involvement. Tim also agreed to provide hair samples. Although experts couldn't extract DNA from them, they were able to compare the hairs under a microscope, which would have been sufficient enough to establish similarity. However, Tim's hair significantly differed from those found on the victim's body and the towel. Based on this fact, he was temporarily ruled out as a suspect. After that, detectives turned their attention to everyone who was present at the bar on New Year's Eve. They questioned Vanita about any individuals who might have behaved strangely or aggressively towards Tanya, but she insisted that the evening had passed without any incidents and proceeded very well. The police also discovered that after breaking up with her boyfriend, Tanya briefly dated a man named Kurt. He happened to be the bartender at the same bar where she celebrated the New Year, and it was a shift that night. They spoke with Kurt, but he claimed no involvement in the murder. According to him, after finishing his shift, he went to a New Year's party with friends. Investigators interviewed his friends, leading to an intriguing discovery. They confirmed Kurt's presence at the party, but said that he didn't arrive immediately after ending his shift at the bar. Gathering all the testimonies, police concluded that theoretically, Kurt had enough time to commit the crime. Through multiple interviews with individuals from the bar, detectives determined that Tanya was last seen alive at 1:15 a.m. However, no one witnessed her leaving the bar. The police also interviewed residents in the area where the body was found. One family recalled driving by that spot around 2 a.m. and stated they were certain there was no body. Investigators established that Tanya was killed within a little over an hour and a half from the last time she was seen alive, and Kurt didn't have a solid alibi during this specific time frame. He agreed to a polygraph test, and the results were inconclusive, showing deceptive answers to some questions. But the lab experts determined that Kurt's blood type did not match the blood type of the killer as identified from the semen sample, so the man was eliminated from the list of suspects. Police continued their search for other potential suspects, but their efforts led to dead ends. The analysis of the killer's semen wasn't possible, and they lacked any substantial evidence or witnesses, quickly hitting a dead end in this case. The only thing investigators were nearly certain of was that the perpetrator must have lived in the area where the body was found. This location was secluded from main roads, situated at the edge of an extensive residential area. Police doubted that an unfamiliar perpetrator would go there with the victim's body in a car without any knowledge of the area. Since then, the case remained unsolved for many years. Timothy, who was only 18 months old when his mother died, was raised by his father and Tanya's family. They all decided to shield the child from the truth about what happened to his mother. As he grew older, relatives told him that Tanya had died in a car accident. This continued until he turned 14. With Christmas approaching, the boy grew curious about the gift his father had prepared for him. Timothy decided to search through his father's closet, only to stumble upon something far more chilling than a mere present. He found a letter written by his father, addressed to the popular TV host, Montel Williams. In the letter, the man asked him to mention the unsolved murder of Tanya, hoping that the publicity would help move the case. Timothy read detailed accounts of the murder in the letter, and that's how he learned the true fate of his mother. In the early 2000s, the local police department reopened Tanya's case, hoping that advancements in DNA analysis would help identify the killer, so they sent all available evidence to the laboratory. Upon examination, experts concluded that the blood on the blue towel found near the body did not belong to Tanya, but to an unknown man. They obtained his DNA profile and uploaded it to the FBI database, but there are no matches. The case went cold again until it was reopened in 2015, exactly 30 years after the murder. The killer's DNA still had not appeared in the FBI database, prompting detectives to try a different approach. Modern tools allowed them to search not only for exact matches, but also for partial ones. They considered the possibility that the database might contain relatives of the killer, which could lead them to the suspect. They began to search and eventually narrowed their focus to a specific individual from the FBI database. His DNA shared some patterns with the sample from Tanya's killer, but the resemblance was relatively weak. Police delved into his family background, even reaching out to his relatives. They agreed to assist and even provided their DNA samples for comparison. After examining the samples, experts reached a disheartening conclusion. They found that this family had no connection to the suspect, leading the detectives, once again, with no substantial leads. In 2018, journalist Tony Adam took an interest in this case. Despite not specializing in crime, his personal interest in this subject drew him to the unsolved murder of Tanya. He wanted to help and reached out to the investigators handling the case. Detectives approached his willingness to help with a degree of skepticism. While an experienced journalist, Tony had no background in criminal investigations. However, given the lack of progress in the case, police figured he couldn't make things worse. The journalist joined the investigation and established connections with Tanya's family. They could see his genuine interest in resolving the case and the significant effort he was putting into it. For instance, he worked to garner media coverage for the case, bringing additional attention to it. He also brought a fresh perspective to an investigation that had lingered for over 3 decades. A year later, in 2019, detectives decided to make another attempt to find the killer's relatives. This time, they sought assistance from Parabon, a company specializing in genetic genealogy. In their previous attempt, investigators had only looked for potential relatives through the FBI database, which contains samples from various criminals. However, Parabon examined public genetic databases significantly broader in scope. Anyone could upload their DNA sample to these databases for purposes such as finding relatives or exploring their ancestry. Experts diligently worked through potential relatives of the killer, methodically examining their family trees to identify someone fitting the criteria of their suspect. They sought a man who, in 1985, was old enough to commit the crime and lived in the area. This process took almost a year, presenting an incredibly challenging task for the experts. However, in February 2020, they finally identified a man who theoretically could be the killer. It was 57-year-old Daniel Wells, who lived in the same city at the time of the murder. Detectives delved into his background and found that Wells had come to the attention of the police several times. In the late 80s, he was arrested for assault and later for indecent exposure. As of 2020, Daniel continued to live in Pensacola, working as a carpenter with a wife and children. But detectives needed a sample of his DNA for a direct comparison with the killer's profile to establish his potential connection to this murder. Due to the absence of any solid evidence, police proceeded cautiously with Daniel, fearing he might flee once he realized he had been identified. They put him under surveillance, and soon the police got an opportunity to obtain his DNA. Daniel threw a cigarette butt out of his car window near his workplace. Investigators seized it and immediately sent it to the lab. Experts extracted DNA from the saliva on the filter and compared it with the killer's DNA from Tanya's case. The results showed a perfect match. 35 years later, the police finally identified the perpetrator, and on the same day he was arrested. Despite having the results of his DNA analysis, investigators wanted to obtain a confession from Daniel. So they chose to proceed cautiously and refrain from revealing all their evidence at once. They asked patrol officers to pull over the suspect's car under the pretext of a standard ID check. Detectives then approached Daniel and told him that he needed to go to the station with them. They deliberately withheld any additional information, keeping him in suspense. During questioning, investigators slowly directed the conversation towards Tanya's murder, asking about Daniel's whereabouts that night. Initially, he denied ever knowing the woman, and that's when detectives revealed that his DNA was found at the crime scene. Daniel continued to deny everything but grew increasingly nervous with each question. Detectives emphasized the undebatable nature of the DNA results, leaving him no chance of avoiding consequences. They made it clear that the only way to ease his situation was to confess. And it worked. At some point, Daniel began to speak. Initially, he tried to justify the presence of his DNA by suggesting that he might have had sex with Tanya on that night. But detectives didn't believe this version and continued to demand the truth. And eventually, Daniel confessed to killing Tanya on that New Year's Eve. However, his story raised some serious questions. He admitted to being at the bar where he met Tanya, who mentioned she was looking for a ride home, so Daniel offered to help. According to his story, they went to his house, where they drank and engaged in consensual intimate intercourse. But then, an argument erupted between the two, and Daniel claimed he can't remember the cause of it. The situation escalated to the point where Daniel, in a fit of rage, grabbed a heavy wooden cutting board and struck Tanya on the head. Realizing she had died, he panicked. Daniel took her body to the location where it would later be discovered and left it there. On his way back, he disposed of her belongings and returned home. When asked about the dog hairs found on the victim's clothes and towel, he explained that his roommate had a black Labrador and those hairs were indeed black. Daniel's story sounded like an attempt to minimize his own responsibility. It was hard to believe that Konya willingly engaged in consensual sex with him, only to have such a severe argument minutes later that led to her death. He also claimed that she died after the blow to the head. However, medical experts had undeniable evidence that the cause of death was strangulation. A more plausible scenario would be that Daniel attempted to assault Tanya and she resisted. He then struck her on the head but quickly realized she was still alive, leading him to strangle her. Despite the fact that the suspect's confession probably didn't align with the actual events, the detectives had everything they needed. Daniel was arrested on charges of murder and placed in custody. Right after that, investigators contacted Tanya's relatives, including her son, to deliver the long-awaited news. Timothy couldn't hold back his tears and thanked the police for finally finding his mother's killer. However, Daniel wasn't destined to face a judge and serve time for his actions. Just 2 weeks after his arrest, his lifeless body was discovered in his cell. The examination indicated that he had taken his own life. Tanya's relatives were disappointed by the fact that the murderer had escaped the prospect of spending decades behind bars. Nevertheless, in the end, they found some closure in knowing that, after 35 long years, the case was finally solved. Alright guys, share your thoughts on the story in the comments section and don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Thank you for watching. A student went out for a bike ride, but never made it back home. From the very first days, her disappearance sparked one of the largest searches the city had ever seen. And soon, the whole country was talking about this case. Detectives chased down thousands of tips and looked into hundreds of suspects, but every lead turned into a dead end. That's how it went, until an unexpected twist finally revealed the chilling truth. Ardith Wood was born on October 28, 1975, in St. John, Canada. Not long after, she became a big sister to two younger brothers, and the family eventually moved to Ottawa. That's where Ardith went through Catholic school and later enrolled in university, diving into history and philosophy. After earning her degrees, she decided to keep going and enrolled at another university near Toronto to pursue a PhD in philosophy. Ardith was genuinely passionate about it and pictured herself teaching at a top university one day. Her professors often remarked on her exceptional talent. In fact, at times, they felt like they were talking to a colleague rather than a student. Outside the classroom, she was active and athletic. She loved swimming, running, and cycling. She also dreamed of having a big family, and she was in a serious relationship, planning to marry her boyfriend after finishing her PhD. In the summer of 2003, when she was 27, Ardith decided to visit her family in Ottawa and spend 2 weeks with them. Her university was about 300 miles away from home, so she didn't get to see her loved ones very often. Since they were such a close-knit family, being apart for that long was tough on her, and she planned to spend as much time with them as possible during her break. On the morning of August 6th, Ardith got up early and went for a run. When she came back, she made a strawberry dessert for her parents and brothers. Later that day, she and her mom were planning to go shopping, but the forecast warned that heavy rain was on the way. So, Ardith decided to head out for a bike ride while the weather was still holding up. She promised her mom she'd be back in about an hour and a half, borrowed her brother's bike, and rode off. An hour and a half later, the rain the forecast had promised finally came pouring down, but Ardith still hadn't returned. Her mom figured she'd gotten caught in the storm and was probably waiting it out under some kind of shelter. But as time passed, the rain stopped, and Ardith was still nowhere to be seen. Worried, her mom called her husband, who quickly went out with their sons to search for her. They drove along the city's Long Park Trail, a popular spot for cyclists. As kids, Ardith and her brothers had spent countless hours biking there, so her family assumed that's where she might have gone. But it was only a guess. Before leaving, Ardith hadn't told anyone exactly where she planned to ride, and her father and brothers couldn't find any trace of her. By then, it was already starting to get dark, and her family was in a panic. More than 6 hours had passed since she'd left the house, and they were almost certain something bad had happened. They decided it was time to call the police. But the local police department didn't launch a full search right away, since Ardith was 27 years old. Her family, though, refused to just sit around and wait. They started calling friends and neighbors, asking them to help. Dozens of people joined the search, combing through bike trails all over the city late into the night. Still, there was no sign of Ardith. The biggest problem was that Ottawa's bike paths stretched more than 100 miles, and no one knew which route she had taken. All they could do was guess that she'd chosen the closest one to home. The next morning, police finally joined the search and set up a command post at the Aviation Museum, a spot where several major bike trails intersected. They brought in dozens of officers and also reached out to the public for help. Photos of Ardith were handed out to newspapers and TV stations, and volunteers were urged to join the search. The community's response was overwhelming. Within just hours, hundreds of locals joined the search. Mounted police showed up, along with helicopters and even the military. Very quickly, the search for Ardith became one of the biggest in Ottawa's history. But, despite the massive effort, there was still no trace of her. News of Ardith's disappearance spread quickly across the city, and soon police were flooded with hundreds of calls and tips. In the very first days, several women came forward with eerily similar stories. Each of them said they'd been approached by a man, and, from their descriptions, it sounded like the same guy every time. They explained that he would approach them on bike paths or park trails that ran along the river, not far from the very spot where police had set up their command post. One woman told officers that he rode up to her on a bike, and, at first, he seemed very nice. He was fit, good-looking, and started off with casual small talk. But then, out of nowhere, he tried to pull her off her bike and drag her into the trees. Terrified, she managed to break free and sped away. Based on her account, police were able to create a composite sketch of the suspect, but they decided not to release it to the public. They were already overwhelmed with tips, and without solid evidence to connect him to Ardith's disappearance, putting out the sketch would only create even more noise. Even if someone recognized him and gave them a name, they'd have no way to prove the link. So, they held off. But in the following days, more women came forward with nearly identical stories. A man matching the same description approached them in local parks, acted strangely, and in some cases even tried to drag them off the trail into the woods. Another lead came from a 16-year-old girl who had been riding her bike in the park. She told police that she'd seen Ardith's photo on the news and immediately recognized her because she'd actually spotted her in the park on the day she vanished. According to the teen, she rode past Ardith, but just a few seconds later heard a woman scream. When she turned around, she saw Ardith standing with a man, and it looked like they were arguing. She kept going, but when she looked back again, she saw the man walking into the woods with Ardith beside him. Something about it didn't feel right, so she circled back. By the time she returned, though, they were gone. Curious but uneasy, she went a little further into the trees. First, she noticed a hat hanging on a branch. Then, just a few steps later, she came across two bikes lying on the ground. But there was no sign of Ardith or the man, and at that point, she decided not to go any deeper. She convinced herself she might just be overthinking things, that maybe she'd only witnessed a couple having an argument. As she rode away, though, she thought she heard another scream. She couldn't be sure if it was real or if her mind was playing tricks on her. When police later showed her the composite sketch created from the other women's descriptions, she confirmed that it looked a lot like the man she saw with Ardith that day. This pushed detectives towards the theory that Ardith had been abducted, and now they had a better idea of where it might have happened. They swept through the park with hundreds of volunteers, and even brought in divers to search the long, narrow river running through the area. For days after Ardith went missing, the effort finally paid off. Divers pulled a bike from the bottom of the river, and the serial number confirmed it belonged to Ardith's brother. At that point, detectives realized the chances of finding her alive were slim, and they shifted all their focus to the riverbanks. That same day, police got a call unlike any of the tips they'd received before. On the other end of the line was a man who sounded panicked. He said he had accidentally killed Ardith near a bike path. According to him, it wasn't planned, it was some kind of accident. He went on to say that afterward, he partially buried her body near the riverbank and covered it with branches. Investigators traced the call and learned it had come from a payphone in a nearby town. They rushed to the scene, hoping the caller might have left behind fingerprints or DNA on the phone. But once again, they came up empty. Meanwhile, police brought in search dogs to comb both sides of the river where Ardith's bike had turned up. And the very next day, the dogs led them to a body lying just a few feet from the water, partially hidden under branches. The decomposition was so advanced that investigators couldn't identify it by sight, and there were no clothes on it, but they knew almost instantly it had to be Ardith. They turned the remains over to medical examiners and combed the crime scene, but there was nothing. No footprints, no belongings, nothing that could point them toward a suspect. Later, medical experts confirmed the victim was Ardith. They determined she had drowned, most likely held underwater until she died. Afterward, her killer dragged her onto the riverbank and tried to cover her with branches. Since police couldn't find any of her clothing, it was clear the killer had taken it with him. Examiners couldn't say for sure if Ardith had been sexually assaulted, but everything about the scene pointed strongly in that direction. After Ardith's body was found, investigators decided to release the composite sketch of the suspect, and it triggered a flood of new tips. Many women said a man matching that description had harassed them in local parks, but none of it brought police closer to putting a name to the face. Over time, detectives built a list of several hundred possible suspects, checking each one carefully, but still couldn't tie anyone directly to Ardith's murder. They also looked into the possibility that a serial offender was responsible, the same man who had assaulted several women in the nearby town where the confession call to police had come from. That predator had attacked multiple women just a year earlier and was never caught. Detectives tried hard to link the two cases, but, once again, they hit a dead end. Even so, tips kept flooding in, and investigators were struck by how many women had run into a man who looked like the composite sketch. When they pieced it all together, they realized he'd been spotted in that very park at least 19 times in the week before Ardith disappeared. Even more chilling, one woman saw him the day after the murder, before Ardith's body had been discovered. Detectives believed he might have returned to the scene to hide the body better, or to collect evidence before police could find it. There was one more detail witnesses kept bringing up. Many of them said the man had an eagle tattoo on his shoulder. At first, detectives kept that information to themselves because it was their strongest lead. But, as the weeks dragged on and they were no closer to making an arrest, they decided to release it to the public. As a result, hundreds of calls came in about men with similar tattoos. Detectives followed up on every single one. But, once again, it led nowhere. In the months that followed, detectives kept working through the flood of tips, more than 4,000 in total. They tried to chase down every lead, which was an overwhelming task. Eventually, though, two specific calls caught their attention. One came in shortly after Ardith's body was found, and the other arrived months later. But both callers pointed to the same man, a local who lived in the same town where the confession call had been made from that payphone. In fact, he lived in the very neighborhood where that payphone stood. On top of that, he had a criminal record, and he had a bird tattoo on his shoulder that matched what witnesses described. Detectives brought him in for questioning, and his behavior was strange. At one point, he even told them they'd never figure out what he was doing on the day Ardith was killed, because he was as elusive as a scorpion. Investigators grilled him for 3 hours, but he gave them nothing useful. So, they called him back for a second interview, this time with a polygraph. By then, detectives were nearly convinced this was their guy, but the results completely blindsided them. The polygraph examiner didn't flag a single lie. With no hard evidence to hold the suspect on, detectives had no choice but to let him go. And the clean polygraph results left them questioning whether he was really their suspect after all. Over time, the flood of tips finally dried up. But detectives kept going through the old ones, one by one. A year after the murder, their lead investigator told reporters that they were still working through their suspect list, which had around 400 men on it. Most had already been ruled out, but a chunk of them were still question marks. Police also put up a $50,000 reward, the biggest ever put up in Ottawa at the time. But not even that was enough to bring them any closer to finding the killer. By the 2-year mark, detectives had run out of leads, and the case basically went cold. That's how it stayed until September 2005, when another young woman vanished in Ottawa. 18-year-old Jennifer Teague, whose story we've already covered on this channel. Investigators immediately looked for a possible link, since the two cases seemed so similar. But in the end, no connection was ever found. After that, the case sat cold for almost another year, and detectives were beginning to doubt they'd ever solve it. They had no physical evidence, and, despite all the eyewitness accounts, they still couldn't put a name to the mysterious man seen in the park. But then, on May 2006, everything suddenly changed. Police in North Bay, a city about 190 miles from Ottawa, got a call about an attempted assault. A woman reported that she was walking home late at night when a man approached her and asked if he could walk with her. She said no and kept going, but he followed, claiming he needed help. He told her he had just moved from Ottawa and couldn't find the address he was looking for. As she started giving him directions, the man suddenly grabbed her and dragged her into the bushes. He tried to assault her, but the woman screamed and nearby residents heard it. One man even ran outside with a shovel and scared the attacker off. The suspect bolted, dropping his phone as he ran. That mistake cost him dearly. Police quickly tracked him down and arrested him. The man was 25-year-old Christopher Myers, who had only recently moved to North Bay from Ottawa. While preparing the case against him, the lead detective suddenly remembered hearing about the Ardith case at a police conference. He dug out the handouts from that event, and, among them, was a composite sketch of the suspect. The resemblance to Christopher was uncanny. He immediately passed the tip on to investigators in Ottawa, who started taking a closer look at Myers. The first thing they realized was that police had actually spoken to Christopher in the early weeks after Ardith's disappearance. An anonymous tipster had called the hotline and named him as a suspect. Detectives had checked him out, but found nothing solid linking him to the crime. He even seemed to have an alibi. The woman who rented him a room said she'd seen him earlier in the day, and by 3 p.m., he had already left for his work shift. Since Ardith was believed to have been attacked around 1:30, it seemed likely he simply wouldn't have had the time to be in the park. About a year later, Christopher's name popped up again when another tip came in. This time, police decided to take a closer look at him and brought him in for questioning. He denied having anything to do with Ardith's murder, and even showed them his shoulders to prove he had no tattoos, something that made detectives doubt whether he really was their guy. But now, with Christopher back on their radar for the third time, and given the fact that he had just tried to drag another woman into the bushes, detectives started seeing him as their prime suspect. The problem was, they still needed hard evidence to prove it. The first thing they did was revisit his alibi. Originally, his landlady had told police she saw him at home during the day, which seemed to clear him. But when investigators went back and spoke with her again, she clarified that she had actually seen him in the morning. That small detail changed everything. It meant that he had plenty of time to ride his bike from his house to the park, attack Ardith, and still make it to his afternoon shift. To be sure, police even retraced the entire route by bike themselves and confirmed it was absolutely possible. Eventually, detectives went to the neighboring city to question Christopher. At first, he flat out denied having anything to do with it. But when they told him that multiple women had spotted him in the park, his story started to change. He admitted he'd been riding his bike there that day, and even claimed he ran into Ardith and struck up a conversation with her. According to Christopher, after a brief chat, Ardith supposedly agreed to walk with him into the woods by the river. But then, he claimed, another girl appeared, spooking Ardith and causing her to fall into the water. He said he left right away, but later came back, only to find her already drowned. That's when he claimed he pulled her body onto the shore, covered it with branches, and simply walked away without telling anyone what had happened. Detectives knew the story was complete nonsense, but, at the same time, Christopher had just admitted to having contact with Ardith on the day of the murder. What's more, the other girl in his tale sounded a lot like the 16-year-old witness who reported hearing a scream and spotting Ardith with a man before they vanished into the woods. It seemed like Christopher had taken her account from the news and twisted it into his own version. Not long after, he backtracked again, saying the whole story was a lie. He claimed he had never been in the park at all, that he had only heard about Ardith's case from the news, and made everything up based on publicly available details. Detectives then put him on a polygraph, and he failed. Even so, Christopher kept insisting he was innocent, and without solid physical evidence, police couldn't charge him with murder. While Christopher was still behind bars in the neighboring city, detectives started digging into his past, hoping to uncover anything that could tie him to Ardith's murder. They learned that his mother had been drinking and using drugs while pregnant, which left Christopher with mental health issues from an early age. To make matters worse, she physically abused him until, at age 4, he was adopted by another family. But 8 years later, even they gave up on him. His behavior had become deeply disturbing and impossible to manage. He talked to himself constantly, stripped naked in public, and grew more aggressive with each passing year. One psychologist who treated him even said Christopher was the most frightening child he had ever worked with. On the surface, his adult life looked more stable. He managed to hold a job, find housing, and mostly stayed off the police radar, aside from a few theft-related arrests. He even had girlfriends, and detectives tracked some of them down to ask about his past. One ex described how Christopher would frequently fly into rages and sometimes hit her. She also confirmed that he was always riding his bike around parks. But then, she told detectives something that stunned them. Christopher had a habit of giving himself temporary tattoos, and more than once, she'd seen an eagle tattoo inked onto his shoulder. This information became the missing piece of the puzzle, the final detail that convinced detectives Christopher really was their guy. Up until then, the tattoo could have blown the whole case apart. If he really hadn't had it, every eyewitness account would have fallen flat. But with a witness now confirming he did have that eagle tattoo on his shoulder, detectives knew they weren't chasing shadows anymore. Still, it wasn't nearly enough to bring the case to trial. What they needed was a confession. 5 months after his arrest for the attempted assault, detectives brought him back in for questioning, this time with backup. They invited in an experienced investigator from the UK, someone with a reputation for getting people to talk. At first, Christopher flat out denied having anything to do with Ardith's murder. But later, he slipped back into the same story he told before, the one about meeting her by the river, kissing her, and then claiming she drowned after another girl startled her. Then, just as quickly, he took it all back. But not long after, he drew detectives a map showing where he said he first met Ardith and the spot where they supposedly went together. He even agreed to take them out there and point everything out in person. But once they actually arrived, Christopher suddenly changed his tune again, saying he didn't recognize the park at all. So, while his story wasn't a full confession, it was just enough to keep him on the hook. But detectives had something else up their sleeve. They believed Christopher might not only be tied to Ardith's murder, but also to a string of unsolved sexual assaults that had happened around Ottawa at the very same time. The pattern was always the same. The man would approach women on the street, strike up a conversation, then suddenly attack and sexually assault them. When police spoke to the victims and showed them Christopher's photo, several of them confirmed without hesitation he was the one who attacked them. Armed with this, detectives hauled him in for another round of questioning. This time, after hours of pressure, Christopher finally broke and admitted to 5 separate assaults. That confession gave police what they needed, additional charges, and, combined with everything else, a much stronger case against him for Ardith's murder. In the end, Christopher was finally charged with murder, and the case went to trial. It took years to get there, but in January 2008, prosecutors put a deal on the table. If he pled guilty, they dropped the charge from first-degree to second-degree murder. In the end, Christopher took the deal. He admitted that he approached Ardith on the bike path, dragged her into the woods with the intent to assault her, and then drowned her in the river. He also pled guilty to several other attacks on women. For all of this, he got a life sentence, but with the possibility of parole after just 10 years. That leniency was part of the plea deal, though it didn't mean he'd actually walk free. His first chance at parole came in 2015, but the board flat out denied it. 5 years later, in 2020, he tried again and was turned down once more. This time, experts made it clear, even after 15 years behind bars, he was still considered highly likely to reoffend. As of today, Christopher is still in prison and it's unlikely he'll ever walk free. Ardith Wood's murder became one of the most infamous cases in Ottawa's history, leaving deep scars on the community. For years afterward, women were terrified to walk in parks or ride their bikes alone. Locals even organized volunteer patrols along the bike paths, groups of people riding together to watch over each other and prevent anything like this from happening again. And one last note, while Christopher admitted to several assaults, detectives were convinced he had committed many more. The issue was that not all of his victims ever saw his face, which made it impossible to tie him directly to every case. As for the Jennifer Teague case mentioned earlier in this story, you'll find the link to that video in the description. Share your thoughts on the story in the comments section and don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video. Thank you for watching. A young woman headed home after a night out with friends, but she never made it. At first, no one could have imagined what happened. But as soon as police got involved, the case took a completely unexpected turn, one that made this investigation truly unique. And yet, Despite having a mountain of evidence, detectives struggled to crack it. But in the end, they found a missing piece, and justice was finally served. Jessica Lynn Kaler was born on May 8, 1982, in Austin, Texas. She lived there with her parents and two brothers until the family later moved to a small town called Pflugerville. Jessica was warm, friendly, and easy to get along with. Making friends came naturally to her. But she wasn't just social, she was also incredibly driven. Even in high school, she had a clear goal. She wanted to be a teacher. To make that dream a reality, she enrolled at Texas State University, where she earned her bachelor's degree in science. But she didn't stop there. Jessica decided to continue her education and work toward a master's degree. At the same time, she took a job as a teaching assistant at an elementary school. On top of that, she worked part-time at a grocery store. With student loans to pay off and bills stacking up, she had no choice but to juggle multiple jobs. Even with her packed schedule, she never lost her positive spirit. Jessica believed that all the hard work would eventually pay off, and she was determined to make it happen. In September 2009, at 27 years old, Jessica was still balancing her studies with two jobs. She was hopeful that soon she'd land a full-time teaching position at her school and finally focus on the career she had always dreamt of. On September 7th, Jessica had the day off, so she spent it with her friends and her cousin Melanie. They started the day by hanging out at the pool, then went out for dinner. Later, they stopped by a bar, played some pool, and when the night wrapped up, Jessica took on the role of designated driver, making sure everyone got home safely. Melanie was the last one she dropped off. By then, it was almost 1:30 in the morning. She offered Jessica to stay the night, but Jessica declined. She had an early shift at the grocery store and needed to stop by a 24-hour store to grab some food for her dogs. So, after saying goodbye to her cousin, she headed out. A few hours later, as morning approached, Melanie got a call from one of Jessica's coworkers. She told her that Jessica hadn't shown up for her shift, which was pretty strange because Jessica had never skipped work without a good reason. Plus, by that time, she had been promoted to store manager, which meant even more responsibility. Melanie started to worry and called a few friends, but none of them had heard from Jessica that morning. Next, she reached out to her brother, John. He and Jessica shared an apartment, but he told her he hadn't seen her either. John worked as a police officer and had started his shift at 5:30 a.m. He hadn't noticed whether Jessica had come home during the night and hadn't checked her room before leaving for work. Concerned, he immediately drove back home, but Jessica wasn't there. In fact, it didn't even look like she had returned the night before. Her dogs were acting strangely, almost as if they hadn't been fed in a while. That set off alarms. Something was definitely wrong. Without wasting any time, John reached out to his colleagues at the police department, asking them to track Jessica's phone. Following the signal, police traced it to a restaurant not far from her home. Melanie and her boyfriend rushed to the location, and it didn't take long for them to spot Jessica's car in the parking lot. But as soon as they got closer and opened the door, they were met with a horrifying sight. Jessica was in the driver's seat, completely unresponsive. Her body was covered in visible sunburns, and inside the car, it was unbearably hot. Melanie's boyfriend called the police, who dispatched officers and an ambulance to the scene. Paramedics confirmed that Jessica was dead and her body was sent for further examination. But one thing was already clear: it looked like she'd been attacked. Meanwhile, investigators began examining Jessica's car, and one of the first things they noticed was that the driver's seat was pushed way too far back. Considering the injuries on her body, detectives suspected she might have been attacked right there in the car. They also discovered that her keys, wallet, and credit cards were missing. On the back seat, they found a bag of dog food, suggesting that Jessica had been there since the night before. After thoroughly searching the car, detectives went into the restaurant near the parking lot where Jessica's car had been found. And that's when things took a shocking turn. One of the restaurant employees told investigators that when she arrived at work early that morning, she noticed Jessica's car, but at that time, Jessica was still alive. According to the witness, Jessica was sitting inside her car completely undressed and acting strangely, almost as if she was under the influence. Despite how bizarre the scene was, The employee didn't think much of it and went inside to start her shift. A little while later, she stepped outside again. This time, Jessica was sitting next to her car. She had put her clothes back on but was still behaving oddly, just sitting there, running her hands through her hair. The third time the employee went outside, Jessica was back in her car, talking to herself and making strange hand gestures. Police found several more witnesses who had seen Jessica alive that morning, but despite her unusual behavior, not a single person called for help or even checked to see if she was okay. After speaking with the witnesses, detectives went back to Melanie and asked if Jessica could have been under the influence of alcohol or something stronger. But her cousin was adamant. Jessica had been completely sober that night. She was the designated driver, responsible for getting everyone home safely, and she had work in the morning. As for drugs, Melanie insisted that Jessica had never touched them in her life. None of it made sense to investigators, but soon, they stumbled upon a possible explanation for what had happened. Medical examiners found signs of strangulation on Jessica's body, marks left by both hands and some kind of material, possibly a rope or a belt. She was also covered in bruises and scratches, and she had been sexually assaulted. According to experts, the trauma she endured could have caused a brain injury, which was only made worse by the fact that she had spent hours sitting inside a hot car under the scorching sun. This might explain her strange behavior, why she seemed disoriented and never called for help. Most likely, Jessica was so out of it that she didn't even realize what was happening to her. And in the end, she succumbed to her injuries. Toxicology reports backed up what her cousin had already said. There was no alcohol or drugs in her system. So, if just one of the witnesses had called for medical help, doctors might have had a chance to save Jessica. But now, it was too late, and detectives had to figure out who was responsible for her death. They focused on finding CCTV footage, but there were no cameras near the parking lot where Jessica had been found. Still, they figured out one thing. If she had bought dog food in the middle of the night, she had probably stopped at the 24-hour Walmart just across the street. Detectives obtained the store's security footage, and there she was. Jessica pulling into the parking lot and walking inside. She was alone and seemed completely fine. There were no signs that anything was wrong. She went straight to the pet food aisle, grabbed a large bag, and headed to the checkout. Everything looked normal, but then, as she walked out of the store, detectives noticed something interesting. Just a few seconds later, a man followed her outside. Reviewing more footage, detectives saw that the man had arrived at Walmart just minutes before Jessica. He parked at the far end of the lot and walked inside, but instead of going into the store, he headed straight to the restroom and then walked back out. Checking the entrance camera, detectives saw him walking directly behind Jessica, and he was definitely in a hurry. But then they hit a problem. Jessica's car was parked right behind a large tree, completely blocking the view from the cameras. Still, the footage was enough to track the man's movements. He walked toward Jessica's car, disappearing behind the tree, and never came back out. 2 minutes later, Jessica's car pulled out of the parking lot. Another camera later captured it arriving at the restaurant parking lot where she would be found the next morning. A little while later, someone stepped out of Jessica's car. This person walked across the lot, heading straight for Walmart's parking area, where he got in the same vehicle the suspicious man had arrived in earlier. At this point, detectives were almost certain this person was directly involved in Jessica's murder. But there was one problem. The surveillance footage was too poor to clearly identify him or his vehicle. Still, detectives weren't out of options. Since Jessica's credit cards were missing, they checked her accounts for any recent activity. And that's when they found a lead. One of her cards had been used at a gas station about 20 minutes after her car was left in the restaurant parking lot. Detectives pulled surveillance footage from the gas station and immediately spotted the red pickup truck their suspect had been driving. And when they checked the camera near the register, their suspicions were confirmed. It was the same man. Now, they had proof that this person had Jessica's credit card, and that only made him look even more guilty. They released footage of the suspect and his vehicle to the news, asking the public for any information about this man. Meanwhile, detectives kept searching for more evidence, but they couldn't find any other leads. Days passed without any major breakthroughs, until they got a call from a woman named Leslie. She told them that the man in the footage looked a lot like her fiancé's best friend, 29-year-old Crispin Harmel. But that wasn't all. According to Leslie, Crispin was supposed to stop by that evening to pay back the money he owed, but he never showed up. Later, when she saw the news report about Jessica's murder, she immediately recognized him in the surveillance footage. She couldn't believe he might be involved in something so horrific, but she still knew the right thing to do was call the police. Detectives began digging into Crispin's background and quickly uncovered an interesting detail. Just weeks before Jessica's murder, a patrol officer had pulled him over for driving with an expired license. When investigators reviewed the officer's body camera footage, they confirmed that Crispin closely resembled their suspect. Even more telling, he was wearing the exact same baseball cap as the man in the surveillance footage. 5 days after Jessica's murder, police went to Crispin's home. Right away, they noticed his pickup truck. It was the same model as the one caught on camera. But something was off. It looked like Crispin had made some cosmetic changes. Chrome details that had been visible in the footage were now painted over in black. When detectives knocked on his door, Crispin surprised them right away. Without hesitation, he admitted that he had met with Jessica that night. According to him, they connected through an adult website and had arranged to meet for a no-strings-attached hookup. Crispin claimed they met in the Walmart parking lot where he got into Jessica's car. According to him, she then drove them to a park where they had consensual sex before she dropped him back off at Walmart. Before he left, they sat in her car and talked for a while. He told her he was struggling financially and, according to his version of events, Jessica gave him her credit card so he could pay for gas. Then, they said their goodbyes and went their separate ways. The next day, when he saw news reports about Jessica's murder, Crispin said he panicked. Afraid he would be accused, he threw away the credit card and repainted parts of his truck. Even though Crispin told this story with confidence, detectives knew it was nothing but a lie. It looked like a desperate attempt to avoid responsibility. The surveillance footage alone was enough to tear his version apart. He claimed they had arranged to meet in the Walmart parking lot, yet he never approached Jessica until after she returned to her car. Then, he said she had driven him back after their supposed encounter, but the cameras told a different story. They clearly showed him walking back to his own truck alone. Jessica's car never moved from the parking lot until the next morning, and no one else had approached it. Detectives seized Crispin's phone and computer, along with Jessica's devices. As they suspected, there was no trace of any communication between them. No messages, no calls, nothing. In fact, Jessica had never even visited the adult website Crispin claimed they had used to arrange the meeting. But when investigators dug through Crispin's computer, they found something interesting. Just hours after police discovered Jessica's body, he had searched for and read multiple news articles about her murder. Jessica's friends and family didn't believe his story either. According to them, she wasn't the kind of person who would go looking for a one-night stand, let alone meet a total stranger in a parking lot in the middle of the night. That just wasn't who she was. On top of that, she had already told her friends she needed to get some sleep before her morning shift and that she still had to feed her dogs. There was no way she would have gone out for some secret late-night date. Investigators believed Crispin was doing everything he could to shift the blame, but with so much evidence stacked against him, there was no way he could come up with a believable excuse. Based on the surveillance footage, detectives pieced together what they believed really happened. Crispin likely spotted Jessica inside Walmart and targeted her. He followed her to her car, got in, and used threats to keep her from screaming or fighting back. From there, he may have forced her to drive to a nearby park where he assaulted her before returning to the parking lot near Walmart, closer to his own truck. Before leaving, he strangled her and stole her wallet and credit cards. When police confronted Crispin with this version of events, he stopped answering questions and asked for a lawyer. Despite the strong evidence against Crispin, investigators faced a serious challenge, one that could put the entire case at risk. The fact that Jessica had remained alive for several hours after the attack created a major legal hurdle. The problem was that medical experts couldn't say with absolute certainty why this had happened. Cases like hers were so rare that medical science simply hadn't studied them in enough depth. As we know, the official cause of death was listed as strangulation. But until that point, there had never been a single documented case of someone being strangled, surviving for hours while walking and talking, and then dying later as a direct result of this attack. Because multiple witnesses had seen Jessica alive, the prosecutor wasn't confident that a jury would return a guilty verdict. The only thing that could truly seal the case was a confession, but Crispin refused to admit to anything. Detectives found themselves in an incredibly difficult situation. They were certain that Crispin was responsible for Jessica's murder. No one else could have physically committed the crime, but because she had remained alive until the morning, there was a real risk that the case would fall apart in court. Hoping to strengthen their case, investigators searched Jessica's car for any additional evidence, but they came up empty. There were no fingerprints, no DNA, nothing that could directly tie Crispin to the crime scene. Still, prosecutors found a temporary solution. They charged him with evidence tampering in connection with Jessica's case. As we know, Crispin had admitted to throwing away her credit card and repanting his truck, both clear attempts to cover his tracks. Since they had his own words as proof, they at least had enough to hold him accountable for some crime while they continued working to build a stronger case. In May 2010, Crispin pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 10 years in prison for evidence tampering. But detectives had no intention of giving up. They were determined to get full justice for Jessica, and to do that, they needed solid scientific proof directly linking Crispin to her murder. For years, they kept searching without any progress. But then, in 2013, they came across a scientific article that changed everything. This article described cases where strangulation didn't immediately result in death, as it typically would. Instead, it triggered something known as delayed death syndrome, a condition where victims suffer brain damage that causes confusion, disorientation, and an inability to seek help. Everything in the article perfectly matched Jessica's behavior after the attack. It also supported the initial medical examiner's conclusion that she had likely suffered a brain injury, which left her unaware of her condition until it was too late. Detectives immediately contacted the author of this article and started building a murder case against Crispin, this time backed by cutting-edge medical science. In May 2014, Crispin was officially arrested for murder, but he continued to insist on his innocence. During the trial, his defense attorney focused on one key point. There was no DNA evidence linking Crispin to the crime. The prosecution had argued that Jessica had fought back during the attack and likely scratched her attacker, which should have left traces of DNA under her fingernails. However, forensic experts for the prosecution pointed out a crucial factor. Jessica had spent hours inside her car, trapped in extreme heat. At such high temperatures, DNA degrades rapidly, and by the time her body was examined, any genetic material under her nails would have already broken down beyond the point of recovery. In addition to the forensic evidence, prosecutors relied heavily on the overwhelming amount of surveillance footage, which clearly pointed to Crispin's guilt. But then, something unexpected happened. Crispin's lawyer questioned the accuracy of the video timestamps used by the prosecution. See, when investigators first got the footage straight from the security cameras, there were no timestamps on it. Since the exact timing of events was crucial to the case, prosecutors used specialized software to add them later. And that single detail gave the defense an opening to cast doubt on the evidence. Crispin's attorney argued that this was a serious violation because he had never been given copies of the surveillance footage with the added timestamps. In the end, the judge sided with the defense and was forced to declare a mistrial. Just like that, Crispin once again escaped conviction, all because of a technicality. However, he remained in prison, continuing to serve his 10-year sentence for evidence tampering. Meanwhile, prosecutors immediately began preparing for a new trial. Over the next few years, Crispin's legal team fought hard to prevent him from being retried, arguing that another trial would violate his rights. But in the end, a higher court ruled in favor of the prosecution, clearing the way for justice to finally be served. The new trial began in 2018, and this time the prosecution made sure to cover every detail, leaving no room for the defense to exploit any technicalities. In the end, They succeeded in convincing the jury of Crispin's guilt, and he was finally convicted of murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Prosecutors had chosen not to pursue the death penalty, fearing it might weaken their chances of securing a guilty verdict. They knew the delayed death syndrome argument could still plant doubts in the jurors' minds, and in death penalty cases, a conviction requires absolute certainty. A few years later, Crispin tried to appeal his sentence, but his request was denied. As a result, he remains behind bars with almost no chance of ever walking free. Jessica's family thanked investigators and prosecutors for their relentless pursuit of justice, even though it took 9 long years to reach a verdict. However, they also admitted that before the sentencing, they had hoped it might bring them some relief and closure. But in reality, no punishment for Crispin could ever truly ease their pain. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section and don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video.